Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by Workology. Today's podcast is part of a series on the Workology Podcast focused on the role and responsibilities of the Chief Human Resources Officer, also known as the CHRO. I'm here today on this podcast talking about the skills and experiences that are the most important and critical to the success of a CHRO. A 2020 report from the Talent Strategy Group found that 83% of CHROs had prior experience working within human resources. But I wondered, what other skills and experience are essential and critical to this role? What does the CHRO need to have in terms of skills, qualifications, a background in order to successfully support those organizations, especially ones that are experiencing hyper growth? And that's what we're going to find out today. This CHRO podcast series is powered by Hub International. Our podcast guest today is Derek Sidebottom. He's a CHRO, a scale-up talent consultant, coach, and distributed workspace speaker. Derek, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Jessica, thanks so much for having me here.
Let's start with your background. You have been in the people business for the last 20 years. How did your roles as an HR director and then VP of HR evolve into your most recent role as the Chief People Officer or CHRO?
Thanks. Good question. Sometimes I'm embarrassed to say it's 20 years, but you do eventually get there. I think in my case, there was some point where functional excellence. I got good at the normal areas within HR, but at some point it expanded to business acumen. And for me, it's probably around the time I did my executive MBA. I did a little bit later on, and I just got much better at prioritizing and framing the business problem and determining the best solution versus starting with the HR solution and then going in search of a problem.
I love that. And I love that you are talking about business acumen. So when you say business acumen, what do you mean exactly? What does that encompass for you?
Yeah, no, I think for me, it's to add value from an organizational effectiveness or design. You do need to know how all the pieces work together, right? To do recruiting really well, you need to know what excellence looks like in each individual contributor or role. So I think I tended to shadow or listen to a lot of the archetypes I've met over the years, and I like to think that I might know their roles better than they do, or at least I try to do so. And I think that to me is a business acumen.
I love it. And I love that we're starting things off with not HR, but business acumen. There seem to be so many distractions around us in the news, politically, personally, and within the business. How are you staying focused so that you can support your organization? And what are you focused on right now?
Yeah, a great question. I think that we're all struggling right now with the news of the week or news of the day or news of the hour. I think for myself, somewhere along the way, I became a bit of a goal nut, right? And it's funny because you work on these OKRs and long-term vision and strategy for organizations, and you realize, oh, if I don't act this way myself, and I'm not taking my own medicine, then I'm just going to get caught up in the fad of the day. So right now, I start with something a couple of years out. I break it down, and the organization I'm in with right now, BehaveVox, we have a Vision 2022. I personally really like the Asana Pyramid of Clarity. So I'll take a long-term vision, and the Pyramid of Clarity has 4 layers to it, basically starting with some kind of purpose, and it breaks it down into multi-year targets, semi-annual objectives, and eventually quarterly goals. And I know it sounds very academic, but if you don't keep yourself focused on why am I doing what I'm doing, you do kind of just get running by, you're managing your day by Slack or inbox or text message or whoever talked to you last. So, look, the plan has to be agile. And every once in a while, you're going to get derailed by, say, I don't know, a pandemic. But if you just let that news cycle or HR trend of the day drive your game plan, it isn't really planned. And then worse, I think we as HR leaders, we get a little derailed and out of sync with the business priorities. if you're not careful. As for how do I stay focused? I try, and I think we're all prone to getting a little off track. And then what am I focused on right now? Very much building our value proposition in the organization I'm in and making sure that we're delivering on it across the board. Major recruiting and scale up mode, which is fortunate, in these days and ages. This is what I'm focused on right now. But for all the people coming in the door, we need to quickly change to talent management.
I love it. And I appreciate you sharing, because I feel like it's so easy to get caught up in just kind of the news of the week or the day or what's being tweeted and various things. But you're talking about having a system, identifying like priorities and values, and then staying focused in those areas. And I think that that's incredibly important right now, because we have so many other things going on in our lives outside of doing our job as HR leaders.
Yeah, I think I realized somewhere along the way, like, if I don't do it, imagine what it's like to be on my team, right? So if I don't take those moments to do what I'm uniquely able to do, right, provide some sense of calmness and stability and direction and predictability of their days, it's going to be very hard to get anywhere. And so as I said, I try to do that, and I'm still learning myself.
We all are. I appreciate your thoughts on this, because really the goal of the CHRO series is learning from each other. And if we can't be in the room together in a conference like we have in the past, we can listen to podcasts and connect over Zoom and different resources to try to fill our cup up that way.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, what skills and experience do you believe are absolute requirements for that CHRO role, especially thinking about those maybe who are just starting out in HR themselves?
The career day speech. Got it. So I probably started to touch on it a little bit a few minutes ago. I think you have to start with functional excellence and a deep understanding of what good looks like in your own function. I think that's the only way you can eventually build teams around you that enable you to play the top level roles. And as an example, like, I've managed multi-country payroll, right, as part of a comp function before. I grew up in compensation. That's where I started my career. I got to tell you, no, it's not what I wanted to do. Payroll, I love my payroll friends; they're awesome, but it's not what I wanted to do. And it's not even how I would design the department nowadays. But I have a much better view on what the auditors are looking for from a controls perspective, which is kind of important when you're in the big chair and you're accountable for all those things. I also spent a lot of time in benefits as well. As an example, like, are these necessary to be a CHRO? Maybe not, but your CFO counterpart is going to want to be sure that you know enough to manage that large expense item as well. So I think we all make specialist or generalist choices as we manage our career, and it's best to probably take on a journeys mindset. I really recommend everyone get a deep experience along the way in each area. If you're a bit shy, make sure you deliver a few training classes, because you need to be confident before you get to the board level. A lot of my colleagues in HR, if you think numbers aren't for you, and much more, I'm much more an intuitive and a people person, then you might want to think twice about your career trajectory, because again, at the senior level, it becomes much more about financials and metrics and having a really deep understanding about what drove those results in the first place. And that's something that only happens when you have deep experience in your own functional area. But once you've mastered that, I think overall the CHRO kind of needs to become more of a chief product officer. Your product just happens to be the organization, right? This is what the highest level of the function is. You've got to be able to build a brand promise that differentiates what you're offering. Then the customers need to know you exist. And then you need to ensure every touch point from check-in to check-out is exceptional, aligned with that promise. And honestly, back to what I was saying earlier, this is sometimes the hardest part of my role. You have to stay at that macro abstract level of thought, despite all the daily pressures to go deeper.
I just want to back up and just repeat what you said. You said, among many other things, but you said overall, the CHRO should be more of a chief product officer, and their product happens to be the organization. I think that is very different than maybe what we've heard. I know, like, when I've attended large conferences or been a part of a professional organization, which I love, but these aren't the kind of things you hear in general sessions. Why is that?
I don't know. I think we all sort of find our own paths, and I had this moment a couple of years ago, and it was for me, I think, transformational in my career, just how I acted even when I started to take responsibility for the org as a product. And I remember talking and coaching a number of CEOs, and it was funny. I was telling them, I feel like you've made the leap from being a founder CEO to a full-fledged CEO when you realize your product really is the org, right? Not the product that you're building, because the org is what generates, everything that makes it possible. And it was probably about a year after I started using that soundbite and it seemed to be hitting people, I realized, well, that makes me the chief product officer, doesn't it? I can't go tell my CEOs that to think about their org as a product and then I not think of it that way myself. So I think we've got a lot of interest right now in design thinking. There's a lot of interesting discussions going on about there. But to me, if you follow that through to the end conclusion, design is just a function of product. And it's kind of a fun way to think about it holistically.
We've never talked about it that way on the podcast. So I appreciate your insights. You're opening my eyes as well. Let's talk a little bit more about CHRO role and how does the CHRO change how company leaderships work with HR, vice versa? You have an interesting perspective on HR as a product, but how does the CHRO in an organization change how a company views and works with HR?
Good question. So this will probably be again through my perspective on what the role is. So take it with a grain of salt. But I know I tend to, in my role, it's funny, I've used the CHRO role or Chief People Officer role, but the CPO title often gets conflicted with the Chief Product Officer. So I always laugh, like CPO is the CPO. It's the same thing. One's external, one's internal. But I tend to adopt a lot of language from the other functions to describe, the product I'm building. I mean, sales, marketing, customer success, development, operations. If you think about it, there's parallels to that. Sales and marketing, that's recruiting and brand. Customer success is some of the employee success and day-to-day services that we deliver. Development, we are actually always developing new products ourselves to accelerate the workforce. Operations, the systems, the infrastructure that we stand on top of. And sometimes I think that we probably just started using our own language along the way. So for me, I started using this parallel language that was actually what the rest of the business was using. And it tended to help by kind of minimizing our own lingo and adopting parallels that the business already uses.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology Podcast sponsored by Workology. We're talking about the CHRO in hyper growth mode. What kind of skills and experience and mindset do you need? And I'm talking with CHRO Derek Sidebottom. This podcast is part of a series, a CHRO series, in partnership with Hub International.
This episode is sponsored by Hub International, your full-service employee benefits broker. Hub International helps you power forward with a tailored employee benefits strategy that evolves and adapts to new workforce challenges. Personalize benefits, engage employees, and manage costs. Visit hubinternational.com today.
Your focus in the work that you do within supporting organizations as the CHRO has been focused on Series A through C hypergrowth. What are your priorities for companies that are in this hypergrowth mode?
Oh yeah, hang on tight. I think is the answer. It's interesting. The first half of my career was more private equity, M&A. Fly in, clean up an org, fly out, which was less fun. And then I kind of consciously chose, no, I want to be in kind of this growth and formative, the early days of company building. It's easier to build it right from the ground up than it is to tear it down and rebuild. What are the priorities for companies in hypergrowth mode? You got to break it up into the basic three parts, right? I think acquisition, that old metaphor, get them on the bus. Management, make sure they're doing the right things to get to the right outcomes. And then operations, make sure that bus can handle a whole lot of people coming and going. I think everyone understands the recruiting challenge, building that to capacity. But to me, the management challenge is probably the thing I I will pull the conversation to, when you do start in any hypergrowth org, everyone understands it's sales, it's recruiting, get that talent in the door, make sure they're here. And then if you're not careful and you don't consciously change your mode, you end up just starting to lose talent at the other side because you've been promising people, things, and you're maybe not delivering on it. So to me, when I ask, like, what's my priority? What's my real priority versus sort of filling recs? And I think there's a story I put on the first slide whenever I go into an org, and I'll try to do it a good enough job here. But the story is about 4 people named everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. And it's a short story. It goes like this. There was an important job to be done, and everybody was sure that somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it. Nobody did it. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought anybody could do it. Nobody realized that everybody wouldn't do it. It ended up that everybody blamed somebody when nobody did what anyone could have. It's anonymous, unfortunately. That to me is a scale-up problem, right? You keep adding people, and you keep changing priorities and focus. And so my CHRO job, beyond my functional excellence job, is to make sure that we get really good at what I think is just 6 core things. Have we defined the right purpose for the org, the why, right? Are we doing the right things to create the right goal stack, the what? Are we clear on accountability? And I really am a big fan of the RACI model. That's the who and the when. Are we paying attention to the right feedback? And that comes down to, are we measuring what matters and continuous improvement? And then are managers effectively creating some kind of connectivity and meaning with teams and staffs and one-on-ones? And the last piece, a lot of people think about it like a soft HR thing, but like, are we taking into consideration our employees' journeys and their interests through their career development? Because if it's all about get this stuff done, they'll go somewhere else. So for me, when I think about like, what is the scale-up challenge, it is it's solving for that. And I think that's the best medicine is making sure those 6 things are working well.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was CHRO's role in regards to talent acquisition. How does the CHRO support the talent acquisition piece of that when it comes to recruiting?
Yeah, you definitely can't delegate it. I've done that. I've done that a couple of times where I think I'll just be accountable and I'll get someone else to bring it. Do that. It's the lifeblood of the company, right? So I think our job at first is to adopt the chief revenue officer mindset, right? If we don't clearly define what we're selling, right, the value proposition, then people will just sell whatever they think it is, and we end up with a bunch of unmet brand promises. So then you have to make sure others know what you're selling, whether that's internal or external. We need to work on what the ideal candidate customer, the candidate or customer profiles are. We need to be very clear on helping to articulate what the channels are and how we're going to manage, our CRM. We think of it as an ATS and a process management tool. But to me, it's all about candidate relationship management because I've opened up the funnels. I'm doing a lot of work. Now I have a timing problem. How do I create long-term relationships if the timing just isn't right? We also need to be really good at funnel milestones and metrics, and of course crystal clear processes. This is how we recruit, and everyone understands that. And then from there, of course, we have to build the team, right? And then we have to optimize that core team and supplement it with a third-party help. Your capacity is always going to lag the business demand. So then you're like, well, what do I do personally after you set up the system and work through those things and create, work through those projects? Like I tend to personally get involved in the senior hires. I think the org gets reasonably good at screening for the what, the job skills, and the how, the values alignment. That's generally quick to solidify. But leadership competencies and scale up readiness of the leaders that you're hiring is a little more abstract. And I find that that's a special role I can play because I have a longer term, more holistic view on the business. And I won't be as tied to like immediate goals where managers might be, as tempted to just make a compromise decision because I only get so many leaders to put on the bench. I need them to be awesome.
You've talked quite a bit about scaling and as a CHRO, but I wanted to ask you more about TA. How do you focus in talent acquisition for preparing to scale a workforce?
Yeah, it's in some ways you have to maybe a shorter answer. You have to start by building TA in a way that it can survive my letting go. I think when I talked earlier about the three core areas you have to worry about, getting people on the bus, make sure that people are doing the right things, to get in the right direction on the bus, and then make sure that bus can manage and deal with a lot of people. I've got to get recruiting. I got to get people getting on the bus working fine so that I can go work on the other two parts. And if I stay personally involved in acquisition the whole time, then who's looking after operations, right? Who's looking after employee success and talent acceleration, parts of our offering. So I think it's weird, and it's the same career advice we give to a lot of people in startup land. Success is actually in many ways giving away what you built, and having it survive and thrive on its own. And it's hard to do. I'm still learning to let go from time to time. And my CEO will say, remind me, like, it's okay to let go. And I'm like, I just want to see this function, just a little bit. And he'll laugh and he'll tell me, just follow your own advice. But I think that's in a scale up operation where you start from 200 and suddenly you're 2,000 and 20,000. There's no way you are doing it all yourself. You've got to be focused on the org again to do that.
What about scaling in HR? Is that different than TA?
I see it. They're definitely different, right? I mean, acquiring and managing are two different things, and ops is its own separate thing as well. But I think you're making me think and go back half a step. Back to maybe my first answer, second answer. I think about vision. In our case, Vision 2022. And I start with, and we've started with, and actually each one of our functions, what statements do we want to make, right, in a couple of years? In our case, I want a high-performing mission-led culture, right, in a couple of years. So you break that down, and I say, look, I want to only hire the world's best. I want to play as one team committed to win. I want personal success to be based on impact, merit, living our values. Part 4. Our tools, processes, infrastructure investments connect and accelerate our global organization. And number 5, softer. It's what, like, people love working here, and it shows. So if you start with like statements that are that far out, and they're things you want to be true, then you just work back and you break it down to like, okay, again, what products and services do I need to offer to make those things true? And hopefully, or maybe this will be interesting for those listening. I mean, I'll share what products I'm focusing on, right? And I've only got about 7 up and running. I've got 4 more in design, but there's a workforce planning program product that we have. There's a brand and external demand, so the marketing piece, taking care of that recruiting supply is in there too. We are a big mobility shop as well, so it's a special product that we do. We tend to relocate a lot of people from around the world. There's the GFR, right? Goals, feedback, rewards. Employee management support services. I've got a technology enablement track. I have a processes and policies track, management training, community programs, and then pulse and feedback. So all I'm doing is taking those areas and upgrading them, defining them and upgrading them over time. And I'm really clear around, like, this is the 1.0, then I'm going to run it for a while, then I'm going to go to a 2.0, then I'm going to run that for a while. And if you think about it again, back to the product mindset, we have this interesting habit of like tinkering with things, and then we're iterating and quick. Like, no one can follow you if you're not really cautious around like, no, we're running the 1.0 and I'm going to take your ideas and I'll upgrade the 2.0 later. So it's more a way of how I think about scaling HR than HR recruiting being different. It's again, start with the endpoint, work it back. What programs and products do you need to deliver really well? Again, break that down into 1, 2, 3 stages, and suddenly you're in bite-sized chunks. And then I guess when I'm hiring the teams, just to round out the thought, when I'm hiring up my own team, I ask myself, is this person fit for the 2.0 or even 3.0 evolution when I'm hiring them? Because if I'm in 1.0 in scale up and they're barely sort of suited to do the 1.0, then that gets really mentally taxing down the road. Like, I need help from them designing the next level up for each of their areas. And that's how I think about it.
What's one thing that HR leaders should focus on training, growing, and learning outside of HR? Because, we talked about business acumen as being critical for growth and human resources, but what other maybe suggestions do you have for somebody who's growing in HR that needs to get more experience? Where should they go? What should they do?
Get out of your own bubble. I mean, spend time with all the other functions. We're one of the few. You think about like what are the advantages? Like on our worst days, we get caught up in our own things and moving paperwork around and doing reviews and hiring people. But you think about it, like not many functions in the org work cross-functionally all the time. Like if you think about it, and so we have this natural ability, and maybe finance and legal are the only other ones where you get to naturally interact with everybody, all functions. And to me, take advantage of that. And if you've ever sort of walked by someone, when we get back to the offices, as we're recording this during COVID, there's nothing wrong with like walking by someone's desk and like, just show me cool stuff. Like, what do you like? People love talking about themselves, and we're supposed to be really good at listening to them. So I think that's probably the right mindset, is just to think, how do I make sure I interact with people outside of my own function, for starters, and then from there, keep exploring, right? What are you reading? What are you doing? How's that fit? What about this? And obviously start to piece it together.
Derek, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. Where can people go to learn more about you and the work that you do?
Thank you. Well, my email address, derek.sidebottom, so at farsidehr.com is the shortest. We have a website, www.farsideHRsolutions.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. I'm everywhere. So I would love to help if anyone's interested in talking about this more.
As a fan of the Far Side myself, I love that it's Farside HR.
We love it too.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's really interesting to delve into how the role of a CHRO whose experience is more closely connected to strategy and operations and the overall business, how they work with the rest of the company leadership team, as well as growing and scaling their HR and recruiting teams and supporting that business. The CHRO doesn't just lead HR within the company. The role is key in structuring the leadership for a company's executive team. I love Derek's point of view on really how he's the chief product officer of the inside of the organization. I think that is an amazing point of view and perspective. I appreciate Derek for taking the time to talk with us today. Thank you for joining the Workology Podcast, sponsored by Workology. This podcast episode is part of a CHRO series, and it is powered by the folks at Hub International. The Workology Podcast is a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. My name is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and until next time, you can visit Workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes. Are you studying for your HRCI or SHRM exams? Join our free HR Certification Study Group on Facebook. Search for HR Certification Study Group or go to hrcertificationstudygroup.com. Ace your HR exams with the HR Certification Study Group. Certification Study Group. Certification Study Group. Certification Study